Hello there. This is John the Gringo.dev reporting live from Mexico City, which is what makes me the Gringo. And today we're going to touch on a hot topic, which is ChatGPT. And I am not going to give my perspective on the drama that has been unfolding there, because there are plenty of people on YouTube who are covering that. And I'm not really a hot takes guy, if I'm being honest. Instead, I am going to focus on something practical. And that is, in light of all of this instability at the consensus largest provider of AI technology and tooling in the entire industry, how can you architect your application so that you are vendor agnostic, not dependent on OpenAI specifically? And so to do that, we are going to look at an example application. And so this might be something like a corporate wiki. And so a corporate wiki probably has thousands of pages, depending on the size of the organization. And it might have all sorts of tribal knowledge. There are policies for HR, all sorts of context about how different parts of the business work, things of that nature. And even though everything is there, it may not be organized in a super fun way, it may not be that accessible. And so logically, you might want to build a chat interface on top of all of that information, such that a new employee, let's say, can just ask questions in natural language that makes sense to them and get an answer back that is contextually accurate. And instead of having to search around, they just get the information they need delivered exactly to them. And so this is a great use case for LLMs and embeddings. And so if you're not familiar, an embedding is a concept from machine learning. And the idea is that you take a bunch of unstructured content, for example, like the contents of a wiki page, and you can distill those down into a compact vector. Vector is just a list of numbers. That's all it is. And so you start with, let's say, thousands and thousands of words, and at the end of it, you get a vector that's maybe just a list of 768 numbers, something like that. And what's really cool about that is that once you have your list of however many numbers, you can take a prompt that comes from the user, and like a question, whatever it is, and you can convert that into a vector, and then you already have all of the vectors for all of your pages. And then for the purposes of answering your question, you just do a search. You say, give me the top 10 documents that are most relevant to this intent, this question from the user, based on their embeddings and the distance between those embeddings. And then you can use that as context that you inject back into the prompt. And so that's a pretty popular way to handle things. But so let's start with that as sort of an overall frame. We're trying to do something like that. That application already exists, let's say, and you want to diversify away from only being OpenAI to instead have your choice of providers. And so the first thing you have to think about is how you're modeling your data. And so you might have a table that looks like this today. You know, your wiki page is represented as a row in the table. It has an ID, content, which is just a text column, and the embedding. So if you're using something like PG Vector or whatever, you can have your embeddings right there in your database. And if it's OpenAI, it depends on the model, right? But maybe it's 4,096 numbers in your vector, right? And so that's the type that you have on the column. And so the first thing that you might want to do is diversify that a little bit in the data. And so you might just do an alter table query in your database. And instead of just having one column that represents the embedding, you can now have n columns that represent the embeddings. And so you might have an OpenAI embedding, you might have a VertexAI embedding, you might have a HuggingFace embedding. And so these are probably the top three providers for embeddings. OpenAI, of course, is the leader. Google Vertex is also a strong competitor in the space. And then HuggingFace has a bunch of open source transformer, sentence transformer type embedding models as well that you can use. And so each of these can have its own dimension. It depends on the model that you're using precisely, but OpenAI might be 4,096, VertexAI Bison might be 768, and I think HuggingFace is generally 768 as well. So, you know, of course you have to look up what model you're using and adjust accordingly, but you could diversify that way. Yeah, I mean, you could also split these up into separate tables if you want to, but let's just keep it simple. So that would be the first thing, just make sure that you're set up to store this data separately, independently of the vendor. And then you would want to embrace probably the provider pattern. So I'm overloading terms a little bit. There's the provider in the sense of the vendor that you're using for getting your embeddings and prompts. And then there's the provider pattern in software where you abstract over differences in the vendor by using a provider interface. And so the interface which you would implement on each provider could be something like this. So you might have a method called get embedding. And so there you're just passing in text. And so that could be the content of a wiki, or it could be the prompt from the user. And then you reach out to the provider of your choice and you get back the vector embedding that you would want for that. And similarly in search, you could pass in an embedding that you already have or have acquired from get embedding. And with the provider that you specify, you would get back however many documents you want that are most close to the thing that you were searching for. And then finally, with prompt, you could say, this could be the text or the embedding, right? Depends on how you want to do it. But you say, hey, here's text from the user, like the question or whatever. And maybe internally you're converting that to an embedding using the get embedding method. And then you pass that over to the provider to get the stream that you would then stream back in the form of the response. And you can do whatever you want inside of that, right? You could say, well, I want to do a search inside of the prompt call, and I want to get the top 5 documents that are closest to this question. I want to inject that as context in the prompt, all that. But that's actually hidden from the consumer of the interface. Like that's all internal to how you're doing things, right? And then the idea is that you have an OpenAI provider, you have a Vertex provider, you have a HuggingFace provider, and then I would suggest that you have a mockup provider as well. And the mockup provider is really just very naive. You could probably pass it anything and get the same response back. And this is just to remove the dependency on an external service when you are using your application locally or in a CI/CD environment. So that way you're not generating a bunch of requests, which might cost you money, by the way, as part of running your test suite or even just running your application locally. So if you don't actually care about getting the results as part of whatever you're doing, which is almost certainly true in the case that you're running your test suite, then you'd want to have a mockup provider for that purpose as well, right? And so you can think of these as just classes, quite literally, that might implement the same interface. So the next step is you have to backfill your embeddings. Now, in the case where you're building an application from scratch, you might have the option of just choosing, okay, every time that we add a wiki page, this table from the beginning, we're just going to compute the embeddings for all of the providers. So you could do things that way. Of course, the trade-off is you're going to spend more money up front. But the payoff, of course, is that at any moment in time, you can just change an environment variable and instantly you can say, okay, we are switching from OpenAI to Vertex. We already have all of the embeddings. We already have it wired up to the prompt service, everything else. And then your application, because it's vendor agnostic, at least up to the point where it makes a decision of what provider to use through the interface, that's actually just doesn't really cost you anything. It's a very easy change to make. On the other end of the spectrum, you could do something like a just-in-time approach where maybe you're happy with OpenAI for now, but you're a little bit scared by some of the drama there and don't want to bet the farm on it. So you implement all of this stuff above, the new data modeling, you implement the provider pattern, all of that stuff. And then you just say, okay, look, the moment where we feel like we need to switch, we will go back and do a batch job or whatever to backfill all of that data so the embeddings are there. Then we switch the variable and then we go. So you have a choice on how you do it, but fundamentally the data needs to be there for the embeddings in order for something like this to work. And then the last step would just be putting it all together. And so you can imagine that your user arrives at your application, they put in their question, the prompt. So first things first, you would check an environment variable that tells you, okay, which provider, which vendor are we using at this point in time? And so then that would route to the appropriate version of the vendor, more precisely would instantiate the appropriate version of the provider. And then you would say, okay, this prompt that we have here, let's get the embedding for that, right? And the embedding, again, is just the vector that represents the semantics of the thing that they're asking about. You would pass that over to your search in order to find the top N documents that are closest to the thing that your user is asking about. Then you would format the prompt to include the context that you got back from your search along with the prompt that you received from the user. And then finally, you would pass that over to the vendor in order to get a stream that you would stream back to the user in the interface with the response to their question, right? And then that can be iterative. You can start that cycle again. And of course, it's just like how an LLM normally works. The previous history of the conversation becomes an input into the context that you're passing forward the next time around, right? So if I wanted to diversify a little bit from just being OpenAI dependent, I would probably do something like this, at least for this use case. So I hope that is useful. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And I always say I'm probably the only tech YouTuber who doesn't have sponsors and never will. I'm doing this to educate and hopefully prevent people from getting scammed by all of these creators who are basically just running paid ads for technologies that may be of questionable quality. So if you wouldn't mind, please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and I will see you guys next time. Happy Thanksgiving.